Welcome, everyone. Welcome, colleagues from here and University of Twente and colleagues from the humanitarian world, family. Catalina's, we've got a very exciting day ahead, especially for Catalina and her family, of course. But in general, also on the substance of early warning, specifically early warning in conflict settings when it comes to the PhD this afternoon. We're very grateful to have Professor Carina Fearnley from the University of London here from the Warning Research Center, one of the most prominent research centers on this very topic in the world. We're very happy to have her on the committee this afternoon, but did want to pass on the opportunity to have her present her work and some recent developments in this field to all of you. She's a geologist by background, so that must be like feeling like homecoming also in this department of geoinformation science and Earth observation. We've got a couple of geologists and geophysicists around here. So, but at the same time, this whole field of warnings and also the way risk is framed in warnings is, of course, a critical topic also for folks more traditionally from the geophysics or also the climate and weather domains, thinking primarily from the hazard perspective, which is also where many of the people here at ITC started off. But we have over time developed this much broader lens of risk and the questions of how this information on hazards interfaces with information on exposure and vulnerability to then in the end allow us to manage risk better and especially manage changing risk better. In that light, the work that Carina will be presenting, I think, will be very interesting, will be a relevant warm-up also to questions of how we use hazard information, especially in context of extreme vulnerability that we'll be discussing later this afternoon. But it's very nice to get a conceptual perspective on how to deal with that question of a generally hazards-focused field still, even though all of us know that vulnerability is so important. So I'm really looking forward to your presentation. I'm very excited that you could join us. So thank you, Carina, for joining us here. It's also nice that this is a collaboration between the Center for Disaster Resilience and the Climate Center of the university. So really beautiful to see this blend and fitting in terms of the testing times that we're in a changing climate, but of course also confronting many of the risks that we've had all along. So once again, a very warm welcome to all of you. Thanks for showing up. There's an online audience possibly as well, so just be aware of that. We'll take the time for Carina's lecture and then I'll moderate some Q&A afterwards. So please enjoy, and Carina, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. And yes, we've got a couple of people online, so welcome. And I believe this is being recorded for those that were very anxious to witness what I'm about to say. So hopefully they won't be disappointed. Hopefully you won't be disappointed. And I feel like I'm the warm-up for Catalina this afternoon, but I'd like you to give me all the tricky questions because I'm used to it. So get them out of your system and we can be really kind to Catalina and her amazing work. So thank you so much for inviting me to come and speak. I'm really excited to do that. So today I'm going to be talking about a new paper that we recently published about changing the way that we think about warning systems. So this is all fairly new material. So hopefully those of you who've seen me before won't be like, oh God, here's the same things again. It's all brand new stuff. So who am I and why should you listen to me? Well, as Maarten's already talked and said, I am the director of the UCL Warning Research Centre. We are the only warning research centre in the world, which is a bit of a shame because it's such an important topic. But I have mostly worked with volcanoes based on my geological background. So there's quite a few volcano images throughout this and some cartoons by the wonderful Ham and Eugenia here. So you've got this lovely volcano there. I just can't control myself. And this is really important actually, because when we deal with multiple hazards and we're dealing with vulnerabilities, volcanoes are incredibly complex because they produce lots of different hazards over different spatialities and timescales. So kind of working on that has really enabled me to transfer my knowledge across a huge range of different hazards. I also love to work with artists and designers and do a whole number of projects, including we've got a new one on scoring warnings. That's thinking about warnings, sound and how we record that, and also involving a big EU grant called the HUT, which is looking at climate extremes and warnings across 10 different demonstrator sites in the EU. So I've recently published a few papers, including around accessibility and disabilities, AI and warning systems, and also multi-hazard. But today, what I'm going to focus on is the vulnerability paper that Professor Ilan Kelman and I wrote. And we both together run the UCL Warning Research Centre, which is essentially based at UCL. We are a conglomerate of, or a joint venture, if you like, between the Department of Risk and Disaster Reduction and my own home department, which is the Department of Science and Technology Studies. So my department's very interested in how we the history and philosophy of science, but also the communication of science, the governance of science, policy, and so on. So that's what we do. We're partnered with the Anticipation Hub, with the Risk Informed Early Action Partnership, and also Doctors Quam in Africa. We do a whole load of range of services. So hopefully that will qualify as to why I might be able to present this paper on behalf of Ilan today around vulnerability. So I'm going to start off by saying what I'm going to talk about. There's 4 different parts to this talk. So the first one is thinking about the Early Warning for All initiative. So that's what the acronym here is for Early Warning for All. Then I'm going to talk about multi-hazard early warning systems. So I'm going to be testing you on these acronyms at the end, right? Because these are literally all acronyms. All vulnerability warning systems, AVWS, which I'm still trying to get my head around. And here we go. These are actual word inclusion as well. So there you go. Very, very, very good. So I'm going to start off by talking about early warnings for all. And as you can see, I've deliberately, very deliberately tried to put a line through the early here. I will come back to that later as to why I don't think we should be calling them early warning system. The Early Warnings for All is a very interesting UN initiative that really drives on the idea that we should have warnings for all. And the reason we have warnings is because we have disasters. And historically, there's been a lot of focus on the fact that disasters are the response of hazards and the interaction with risk. So we often see these kinds of probabilistic kind of phrases here: hazard times vulnerability equals disaster, or probability of something happening is disaster. And there's actually been a lot of work, not just recently, over like the last 50, 60 years, that has really highlighted how the problems, the reasons we have disasters is because of vulnerabilities, right? So there's been a huge campaign called No Natural Disasters, or Disasters Are Not Natural, to really try and highlight this, because we often use the word, certainly in the English language, natural disaster, but we would argue there's no such thing as a natural disaster. It's a human-generated thing. So historically, we've really seen this focus on hazards rather than the vulnerability, even though we know from books like At Risk, like Ben Wisner and so on, that vulnerabilities are a huge component of what we're seeing here. So if we're focusing only on hazards in our warning systems, how are we possibly generating a warning system for all? Okay. Now, of course, we need to have a warning system in place. If you don't have a warning system in place, you can have a problem. And this is a picture of the 2004 Boxing Day tsunami that happened in Indonesia, now 20 years ago, where over 250,000 people were tragically killed by this tsunami. Now, what's interesting about this situation was that in the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center and the USGS and many other agencies had detected that there was a very large earthquake. This had the capacity to generate a tsunami. Unfortunately, that message was not communicated. And we can even see, like more recently, when we had the Kamchatka earthquake and the tsunami generated, very, very different story. Like we were really aware of what was going on. Information was spread very quickly by social media and so on. But the reality is if we do not have warning systems, if we cannot communicate with one another, then we're going to continually see these kinds of incidents happen. And thankfully, we haven't seen something on a scale like this for quite a while. So let's take a step back and say, well, what does a warning system actually mean? And I love this definition. It comes in 3 different parts. And I think it's really important to understand the definition of a warning system, because I often sit in meetings and people often think that a warning system is like the siren that happens. It's the fire drill that happens, right? And it's like, well, yes, that is a very important part of it, but it's only part of the whole system. So this UN definition is really important because it breaks warnings down into 3 key components. The first being an integrated system, which is all around monitoring the hazard, forecasting, disaster risk assessments, communication and preparedness activities. So that's all the kind of work we do around the disaster preparedness and anticipation. We then secondly have to work with lots of different stakeholders. So that's the individuals, communities, governments and businesses. So those, we have to contact and be engaged with all of those different stakeholders. And then we have to try and produce timely warnings. Nobody wants a warning that they're about to die with 5 seconds to go. It's not very helpful, right? So we want to try and create timely warnings, although there are limitations around that. But the reason that warnings are so fascinating, and I'm sure Kathleen will agree with me, is because they bring together a huge range of different experts. They have to establish thresholds and tipping levels at all sorts of different parts of the warning system. And also they need to be designed in a way that they can be communicated through icons, like traffic lights is obviously a very well-known one, and different communication forms as well, like radio, social media, cell broadcasting, and so on. Now, the Early Warning for All initiative was born from a study that the World Meteorological Organization did. And they found through their studies of meteorological agencies globally that 1 in 3 people did not have access to a warning system. And in Africa, this was as low as 1 in 6 people. And so as part of this report, Antonio Guterres decided to create this initiative, Early Warning for All. Let's make sure that everyone has access to a warning system. Now, this is a hugely admirable initiative, but at the time I was a bit like, this is opening a complete can of worms. This is a great initiative, but to actually do this is very, very, very difficult and very challenging. Also, by what do we mean by a warning system? What do we mean by everybody? How, is it going to be effective, or is it just we're all going to get notification, but we can't do anything about it? So when we're thinking about warnings, the Early Warning for All initiative generally focuses on hydrometeorological hazards and doesn't include the geological ones. So I feel quite upset about that as a geologist. I feel like we have a lot to learn and share around this information. So I kind of feel like actually we need to be considering all of the natural hazards. We often have volcanoes and typhoons happening at the same time. It seems implausible, but it happens. Mount Pinatubo, 1991. We also have lots of human-made threats and hazards happening at the same time. We have war, we have conflict, we have chemical industrial incidents, we have cyber attacks. This limits the capacity for people to respond to a natural hazard generated event, an incident. On top of that, we are living in a world where we're seeing multiple things happening at the same time. A crisis will happen during a time of the pandemic, for example, COVID. We might have flooding. We might also have conflict. We might also have a cyber attack. We might also have some local hazards like wildfires happening and storms. So, we never really get one thing at a time. It's many things happening. And often these can obviously cascade. We can get, like we saw in Tohoku with earthquake generating, tsunami generating a nuclear meltdown, which then led to food poisoning and contamination of fish stock all across Asia and the Pacific. And then on top of that, we've got emerging risks. So the kinds of things that we're not really sure of and we can't really kind of factor in, but we've got obviously climate change and we've got new technologies and approaches to things like AI, for example. And social media, which isn't a new technology, but it's just really changed the way that we think about in terms of warnings. So the Early Warning for All initiative has been really good. They've produced a whole series of reports. They've really helped promote understanding around what the warning systems are, what we should be doing. They've created all sorts of dashboards with all sorts of metrics. And this has been quite a valuable initiative. In particular, they've spent quite a bit of time focusing on cell broadcasting. If I just go back here, you can see as part of the Early Warnings for All, there are 4 key lead UN organisations here: the World Meteorological Organization, International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Agencies, the United Nations Disaster Risk Reduction, and the International Telecoms Union. So ITU, the International Telecoms Union, have been working really hard at trying to make sure everybody in the world can have access to a mobile phone alert or cell alert. Do you guys say mobile phones or cells here? Mobile, okay. It's very British. I could have quoted that. Cell for the Americans here. But no, it's cell broadcasting technology, which is this wonderful technology, which means that, you know, if you went hiking on a holiday to Iceland and you were like, God, I want to go and see Hekla volcano and climb that volcano, but suddenly the volcano starts to show signs of unrest, there's very little time for that volcano to warn people. So the fact that you could send a message to the relevant cell masts in that area, that means that anyone who's within that area will get that message, and that message could come in the language of your phone. So if you were an Arabic person, Arabic speaking person, it would come up in Arabic on your phone, so you'd actually understand it, as opposed to Icelandic, which I'm sure most of us in this room could not understand, can actually know what's going on. Whether they can take action or not, you know, but hopefully they'll be able to take action and do something. So it's really about trying to reduce the fact that we get thousands and thousands of messages on our phones every day, and actually trying to cut through that and say, here is something that's immediately dangerous to you. Now, obviously, this requires to have a mobile phone. Doesn't necessarily have to be a smart mobile phone, but a mobile phone and network and access to that network. But it's really good because it's not sending a text message, because text messages can be very slow. This is a very direct message. You don't have any data issues about registering your phone. It just goes out. It's got no record of which phone it goes to. So there's a huge project going on right now to really try and make sure that this is rolled out globally. And this is probably the quickest and most efficient way to try and get early warnings for all, to increase those numbers so that as many people can get a warning, okay? A warning. What they can do with that warning, different question. Another really big initiative is really about thinking about how to engage with communities. So this is a still shot, for example, of how a lullaby can save lives. So many countries in the world use oral traditions and folklore as part of their warning process. And unfortunately, this is a part of warnings that isn't often recognised within warning systems. But the good thing, at least, is with the UNDRR and also the Red Cross have done a lot of work working with local communities who maybe don't have their own folklore, people who've, transient populations or have been removed from their home countries and now experiencing hazards and landscapes they're not familiar to, having some form of lullabies, storytelling, performance to help them understand the telltale signs and what they need to do. A really good example, if a tsunami comes, what do you have to do? Anyone tell me, what's the first thing you have to do if a tsunami's coming? Away from the coast and high ground, right. It's really as simple as that. We don't need to have a hugely sophisticated warning system, right? It's really as simple as that, okay? Now, obviously, the challenge comes in if you're on a flat piece of land. So say it happened here in the Netherlands, quite flat. How are we going to get to high ground? Well, we then now need to think, okay, well, if we get a warning, we can't get to high ground, we need to build evacuation structures so that people can get to safety. So this is where warnings are actually part of the broader disaster risk reduction process. So this is a really good initiative. And also something that's also quite interesting that's coming out of Early Warning for All is sort of all of these metrics and indices that are being created to try and establish what an effective warning system is. And I don't think anyone has the answer, but it's interesting watching people try, okay? And I'm going to have my own stab at it. towards the end of this year. I've got an idea, I need to write it up as a paper. But it's really interesting thinking about how can we look at what warning systems are, what capacities are, what's hindering the performance of warnings, how are they being evaluated, how can we learn and enhance from events where we've learned lessons, because we might identify lessons, but we might not actually learn and implement those lessons going forward. So there's all sorts of wonderful databases that are coming out that are giving us more and more data and getting people thinking about how effective these warnings actually are. And of course, it's our remit to do so. The Sendai framework of the UN 2015 to 2030 has target G as the ability to increase the availability and effectiveness of multi-hazard warning systems to everyone. So it's our remit to do this, so to speak, as a global community set by the Sendai framework. Now, what's interesting is that early warning systems are typically divided into 4 elements, right? And these are actually, in the early warning for all, these have been converted to pillars. So we've got here the pillar 1, which is disaster risk knowledge. The idea that we need to know what is the disaster that we're facing. The second one is, well, let's observe it, let's get the forecasting information and know what we're going to do about it. The third part is then communicating and disseminating that. And the fourth part is preparedness and being able to respond to that warning. And one could say that you sort of go from pillar 1, 2, 3, 4, but it doesn't work quite like that, which is why it's represented as a circle, because these things kind of happen all at the same time. But when the Early Warning for All initiative first came out, one of my biggest criticisms about it was this, which is how do we link these 4 different pillars and elements together? So this is a paper that Carolina Garcia and I wrote in 2012. And we actually looked at lots of different warning systems from all around the world. And we looked at what made warning systems fail and what made them succeed. And what we found was that actually it's the links, the things that connect those 4 different elements and pillars that are really critical to the success of a warning system. Things like effective and continuous communication, risk education, multi-hazard scenarios, putting research into practice, good governance, preparedness, awareness and trust, accountability, and so on. And that was really, really critical. And so we proposed that there should be a core pillar as part of it that brings all of these 4 things together and looks at how they work together in order to succeed. And I have to say, although it was very well received by the UNDR, it was not so well received by other groups, but I have to say that over time we have actually seen this more. So this is actually quite a recent diagram of the early warning for logic model. And you can see here a cross-cutting pillar here, not just in terms of administrative and management perspective, but in terms of political awareness, supportive coordination, action, and so on. So there is some influence that we can have here around some of these global agendas to try and make sure that we do all have a role in making early warnings for all. So now I want to move on to multi-hazard warning systems. This is the panacea, the latest panacea. And actually earlier this year, I published a paper with Mariam Rukaida. We actually reviewed what is going on with multi-hazard warning systems and how has progress been in the Sendai framework. But in this recent paper by Ilan and myself, we talk about a number of different warning systems to show that there's lots of different types of warning systems. So at the top, you've got the African multi-hazard warning system here. So lots of different aspects of vulnerability are included in the warnings and lots of different hazards. We might have something like the Planetary Defence Office of the ESA here, looking at near-Earth objects, so asteroids and comets that are coming in. Very specific type of hazard, but quite a kind of regional and global initiative. And then we have people like the USGS that provides globally information around earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. This information's free, it's globally accessible, but it is of course dependent on the funding of the US government at the same time. So we have lots of different types of warning systems. This is just to give you a flavour. So I just want to now tease out, what do we mean by all these different types of warning systems? Well, this is a diagram of a multi-hazard warning system. Yes, it's a good go. I think we need to update it, but it's a really good start at it. But the idea here is that we're dealing with lots of different hazards, and we're thinking about hazard information, thinking about multiple risks and exposures and vulnerabilities and the interactions between multi-hazards and then the types of warnings. And then we disseminate and communicate this to the public, and all these different, different groups have to be involved in what's going on. And there's a lot of feedback and interaction going on. So in essence, that is a pretty good framework for a multiple hazard warning system. But in reality, it's incredibly complex to put into place, incredibly complex. In fact, I only really know of one or two places in the world that are even vaguely getting towards this point. So with multi-hazards, we're dealing with situations where we might get cumulative, concurrent, cascading hazards, or, it's things that are just totally unrelated to each other happening at the same time. So it's very, very, very challenging. And there's been a lot of work around multi-hazard warning systems that makes me, if you were someone just looking at it online, you'd think, there's a lot out here, actually, it's good. But when you read it, there's really not a lot of substance to it, okay? So we kind of stated that there's three really important challenges that we need to address here. Firstly, what does a multi-hazard warning system mean? So when we say, when we do all these indices and we say, the Netherlands has a multi-hazard warning system, does that mean it's got one system that issues warnings for flooding, drought, climate issues, health, and so on, which actually considers the interactions of them? Because, if you've got a pandemic and flooding happening, who's going to evacuate and who's going to stay at home? Because there's a contradiction there in terms of what's required to respond to the two hazards, either stay at home or evacuate. So there's challenges there around how do you actually do that? So is it a one system that deals with multiple hazards, or is this term actually saying the Netherlands has lots of different warning systems for different hazards, one for weather, one for raining, one for flooding, one for this, yeah? So we don't, there's a misunderstanding here about what is actually meant by multi-hazard. It's a very fundamental point, and I think we miss it. But are we talking about one system that deals with multiple hazards, or are we dealing with a country that has multiple hazard systems, plural? Okay, so we need to get on the same terminology for a start. Secondly, we need to mobilise and strengthen existing warning systems. We can't just reinvent the wheel. We have to work with what we've got. And government doesn't like to rework the wheel either. So let's work with governments in existing structures to try and facilitate multi-hazard warning systems. This is, of course, very difficult when we're in fragile and resource-poor contexts in particular. And then we need to fairly foster collaboration between all the different stakeholders and actors involved in warnings, so that we can really make sure there's this integration going on. And I will come back to that point throughout the presentation. Now, if you remember, what was the word that I crossed out at the beginning of the presentation? Oh, you are paying attention. Excellent. Yes, early. How early is early? So my biggest bugbear is this word early. Does it matter if a warning's early, or if it's on time, or if it's late? If you get an earthquake warning of 50 seconds, is that early? Or is that actually late? What does it mean? So all of early, medium, on time, late warnings are all very, very subjective, and they're also dependent on the hazard. If we're talking about a tornado, we might only have a few seconds or minutes. If we're talking about El Nino, we might have a few years. If we talk about a comet coming and destroying Earth, like the extinction of the dinosaurs, we probably have thousands of years. So how early is early? Because that's an early warning, isn't it? That one day we're going to get a comet that's going to come and hit Earth and it's going to cause a problem. So this timescale aspect of it is a little bit of a red herring. We have to go back to the definition. that the timeliness is appropriate enough for us to be able to do something about it, right? That's the key thing here. Now, this is a model that Simon Day and I made to try and unpick this issue of timing of warnings. And we basically decided to classify warning systems, which my supervisors for my PhD incidentally really hated, just so you know. Then they were like, don't do this. But I think it's really useful. So we basically said, instead of just thinking about warnings as warnings, let's try and break it down. So we've got warnings where we're being responsive. You know, there's an earthquake that generates a tsunami. You have got 20 minutes or 20 hours to respond on this, depending on which part of the Pacific Ocean you are, for example. Okay. And that you can use your text alarms, you can use your sirens, you can use community-based warnings and traditional oral traditions, like the sea goes out, let's get to high ground. Okay, fantastic. That's our responsive systems. Anticipatory means we can't wait until the event happens, because once it happens, it's too late. Anticipatory obviously stems from a lot of the climate change work done in the early days. The idea that we need to anticipate what's happening. So with a volcano, we need to evacuate people before it erupts, because if you're living on the volcano and it erupts, you have probably up to a minute to phone call them, the village, and say, by the way, the volcano's erupted. So by the time you've got to the phone, dial the number, everybody's died. Not useful. Okay, so what do scientists want to do? They want to get everyone off the volcano. What do local governments and local leaders want to do? Keep everyone at home as long as possible, because that's where their safety, their livelihood and their normal life is. So anticipatory is a great ideal, but in practice it's really hard to implement. But the idea is that we anticipate things before they happen, evacuate or take certain actions. And permanent systems are like things that exist irrespective of whatever's going on. So this could be like flood barriers, like you have lots here in the Netherlands, we have one in London, for example. These are permanent structures where you just press a button and it will avert a disaster from happening because it's there permanently. Other things that would come under this are the common alerting protocol, which is used to give warning messages globally. The Earth observation systems that we have set up globally to bring data together, looking at longer term, slower onset hazards such as desertification and drought and so on. So this is really about that kind of automated, you know, constantly there process of warnings. And we sometimes get these integrated warning systems, such as we see in food and agriculture, that tries and brings data from all the different types of warning systems to look at different trends over time and give information about what might be happening in the future. Now, spatially, warnings are challenging as well. So not just in terms of time, so early, medium or late, doesn't matter, but we are characterised by the different hazards that we have and the limitations of that, and the type of warning that we can have. But then we also have the spatial element, right? So we know that we can have these big regional hazards like tsunamis in the Pacific or the Indian Ocean, or we could have a very, very localized incident, like a terrorist activity that happens in one very small building. It really can range at huge different levels. And so we end up having warning systems that are global, such as our near-Earth objects. We can have regional, like the tsunami warning system in the Pacific and the ocean. We will have national systems, which are basically our legal remit to have as a national system. We can also have very localized systems that are in place. And this makes quite a challenging situation when it's like, well, how does the international speak with the local? Because it needs to be relevant to the vulnerable person who is local, but yet there's this international system. So it really depends on the stakeholder. Also, when we're thinking about time, we're thinking about rapid onset, slow onset, whether the events are frequent or infrequent. Is a warning system for safety, property, environmental or terrorism activities? What types of hazard are we talking? And is it human or is it automated? So these are kinds of some of the issues around warning systems. So why are warning systems failing? Well, first, I've already said it's about the links between the different four elements and pillars. But also, It's because warnings are ultimately for people. They're not for hazards. The hazard's kind of irrelevant. The warning should be about for people. And warnings need to be personalised for an individual. But that's really difficult because we have different locations, different resources to respond, and we go through different stages of life. You know, you can be vulnerable, you could be fine now. If the incident was to happen now, we could all be fine. But if it happened in 10 minutes' time when you're having a migraine, or perhaps you've had a stroke, your outcome's going to be very different in that 10 minutes. So thinking about your different stages of life and that moment. So when we think about warning systems, what might have worked recently might not work now or in the future for anyone, a nation, or internationally. So we need to have a process of actually involving and thinking about all of society when we're thinking about warnings. So this is where we come to our all vulnerability warning system. So this is really the idea that we want to make sure that everyone is protected by these warnings for all sorts of different hazards. And this brings together all the good things around disaster risk reduction, anticipatory action, and resilience efforts. And so what we want to do is focus more on the vulnerability, because by focusing on hazard characteristics, we're actually undermining the whole principle of the Early Warning for All initiative, and also the idea of multi-hazard early warning systems. Because what we want to be doing is actually generating resilience and capacity within communities to deal with whatever hazards they might have. We also tend to focus on events. You know, we invest in these big earthquake warning systems. That's in a very event-driven. But what about the things that we could be doing that could have a much broader impact on society in everyday life? And I'll come back to that shortly. And of course, climate change isn't really part of early warning for all, or a lot of early warning systems either. They still circulate in their own different groups and networks, and there's not a huge amount of interaction, even though there's a huge amount of overlap. We are starting to see that come together, which is great. So what we need to do is we need to really think about people as part of their environment. We can't separate people from their environment and their circumstances. So here's a typical list of some of the vulnerabilities we might see. We've got individual demographics, population demographics. We've got different worldviews that might bring in different religious perspectives, or political views, financial, governmental, social structures, discrimination, oppression, and marginalisation, to name just a few. So these are the kinds of vulnerabilities that pretty much everybody is dealing with. And it's kind of interesting because when it comes down to vulnerability, the person who actually is best knows this is the individual themselves. And this is a wonderful model by Captain John Boyd of the American military, who created this OODA loop, which is observe, orient, decide, and act. And what he says is that in any kind of situation, an individual will go through these different aspects of an event. So say we've got a hazard that happens. Someone's going to observe what's going on. Okay, there's been an earthquake, the water has retreated out. Okay, I'm observing now. I'm going to try and orientate myself. I remember at school learning about how a tsunami means that the water retreats out. I remember there's a story that I learned about it in my book that I read. And I remember seeing some film about it. So they're orientating that knowledge to kind of confer with what you're seeing. You then decide what to do. Well, what am I going to do? I'm going to run to high ground. I remember I've got to get to high ground. And then you act. You actually do that. Now, obviously, if there's no high ground, it kind of fails, right? Because you can't actually do any decent action. But assuming that you can, you would constantly go back here. You'd observe what's going on, orientate and decide. Okay, I've climbed this hill. This hill isn't high enough. This is a much bigger tsunami than I thought. I need to get to even higher ground, right? So, and then so on and so on. So ultimately, when it comes down to warnings, it is very much the individual that has to take the responsibility. And often the individual doesn't have the capacity to do that. And that's where a lot of work's being done around early warning and impact-based forecasting. So this idea that we're kind of getting the indications that something might happen, a hurricane is coming, But before it hits, let's release the money, because we're pretty certain it's going to hit. Let's release the money so that people can take action rather than wait till it hits and have to deal with it afterwards, which will be more expensive. Not just in terms of economics, but in terms of people's livelihood, their family, their way of being. So there's a lot of really great action that's going on here. So vulnerability can also be part of the governance, the resource allocation, and the political regime and power that's in place as well. So if we compare places like Cuba, for example, to America, very different structures of politics that also drives the types of disaster risk reduction and warning effectiveness that's in place. And it needs to be localized. But often warning effectiveness, as I talked about, all the indices is often related to hazards. We very rarely think about the close calls or the near misses or the false alarms. And often we only ever really talk about the one hazard and not the context or the systemic risks that are in place. And these are driven by political ideologies. And it's kind of interesting because there's this wonderful model here by Andrew Sterling. He's my academic god. Like, you know, everyone has an academic god. This is my academic god. And he has this lovely model that sort of says, you know, can we actually do something about a threat or a hazard? Well, yes, if we can prevent it, let's do it. Let's send Bruce Willis up to that meteorite and blow it up, and then we're all going to be safe. Brilliant, fantastic. Okay. Oh, we can't do that. Okay, but there's still some scientific uncertainty. We don't know if climate change is real or not. Okay, we're going to create an international panel of climate change experts. We're going to discuss this and bring the evidence together. And maybe we should start thinking about what we're doing with our Earth. That's the precautionary principle. But if it's also socially political ambiguous, which you could argue climate change is, of course, that would require deliberative action. That means dealing with citizens, engaging with the citizens, stakeholder negotiation, thinking about different views, ambiguous values. People have different values about whether we should be doing something or not. And that's really where we're at in terms of the vulnerability warning systems, is that it needs to be this deliberative process, because we're talking about quite often uncertain science, and there's a varying perception of what that threat or hazard is, and a varying perception of what the vulnerabilities are. Of course, if none of this exists, we can just do a risk assessment and we'll fill out our forms and we'll all be fine, and they'll be registered. Now, doing this kind of work, both internationally and locally, working across all these different timescales and spatiality, really means working across top-down and bottom-up approaches. And actually what sits in the middle between those local communities and those big intergovernment initiatives like the Early Warning for All is the scientific community and the civic society sector, who are generally acting as a conduit or as a communicator or a mediator between these different groups to connect that bottom-up and top-down approach. So we really need to make sure that we all, this is basically what these quotes are saying, is that we all, as different scientists, different actors, different individuals, work collectively to try and create this communication, interaction, so that warnings can be more efficient and more inclusive. So what is this all vulnerability warning system? So, nice quote from the paper there. Since a disaster is a process caused by vulnerabilities over the long term, and warning systems are social and societal processes that need to be developed and implemented over the long term, warning systems could be reframed to focus on vulnerabilities. So rather than having a warning system focused on hazards, let's make it focused on vulnerabilities. And this would generate and complement multi-hazard warning systems by thinking about warnings for all, because we're thinking about the people, and it serves everyone on their own terms, irrespective of the hazard and the multiple hazard situation. Now, there are two key aspects that support this, which is we need to work across different people, because vulnerabilities are perceived differently and people have varying experiences of the same incident. So if you've got a flood, if you're in a wheelchair versus you're an able-bodied person, that creates a different perception about that event. And then, of course, people will perceive hazards very differently as well. So they've got their own vulnerabilities, their own hazards, their own perception to the hazard as well. So there's all sorts of challenges here, but we really feel like these could work because it's really recognising that actually what's the value here is about understanding how people respond to warnings, and why they might not respond to warnings. What is their actual understanding and their ability to respond? And to really determine what challenges are in place and how to overcome them prior to the event. There's been lots of work around vulnerability to try and address issues around vulnerability, maps, tables, infographics. So there's been a huge wealth of work that's tried to do this, but not in a warning context. It's kind of interesting to think, how can we do this within a warning context? And so far, no single approach has really been that satisfactory. But what an all vulnerability warning system asks us, it makes us do, is think ahead of the disaster and to develop, maintain warning systems that are with the community and are embedded within that community. So this is essentially the graphic from the paper, which is, thinking about, pre-thinking about disaster and the costs and the benefits we have by doing this work, which leads to better developing, testing, implementing, monitoring and evaluation of warnings, which helps us understand what defines success and failure. And then we get our all vulnerability warning systems, of which multi-hazard warnings are part of that process. So it's really encompassing multi-hazards and multi-vulnerabilities. So in the paper, we go through a number of different disasters that are mentioned, where they've been good, or where a warning, an all vulnerability warning system could actually have been more useful, given that incident, in terms of supporting actions. So, for example, in Nevada de Ruiz volcano in 1985 in Colombia, warnings were impressively accurate, but people still died. 23,000 people died. What could have been done better was if they'd been more focused on addressing issues of language, understanding and vocabulary between scientists and the local officials, then probably those disasters could have been averted. So that's where a more vulnerability-focused warning system could have perhaps prevented that disaster. Now, of course, no warning system is or could be a panacea. And it may not be possible that this is the answer to everything, because these need to be consistently costed within the resources capable within countries to set up these all vulnerability warning systems, which are not expensive, but require a lot of time and effort within communities and practitioners to understand. But warning systems aren't just about saving money. They're about livelihood and saving lives. So we need to make sure that these are embedded in society, all hazards, and a part of the day-to-day life. So for creating warnings for all, I just want to wrap up in the very last couple of minutes, because I appreciate we want to finish very soon. Some of the challenges around making sure that warnings are addressing all vulnerabilities, which is actually to make them inclusive. So unless you can speak Arabic, you probably can't read the slide. Can you read the slide? It'd be a bit crazy if actually we were in a situation where an alarm was going off right now, and this information was coming up on your phone, and you'd be like, what is this? What does this mean? What's going on? I don't understand. I've got this siren going off and people are running around, but I don't know what's happening. And also you might notice that, of course, being Arabic, it's written from right to left for a start. So there's different, it's not just actual language, it's different sort of ways that language is presented and the vocabulary that's used. But when we're thinking about inclusivity, we have to think about everyone. We have to think about saving lives, whether different genders, different minority groups, different people in different situations, whether they're in prison, whether they've got mental health issues, whether they're undocumented, displaced people. And often a person has many of these things at the same time. So they're intersectional. You are a female lesbian who has been displaced due to conflict, and you might even have a disability thrown in there as well, right? So we're all complex beings. We all have different things going on. So it's complicated. And it's kind of interesting because when we think about inclusivity, You know, we talk about inclusivity as if we're talking about the minority, right? But who do we think about when we talk about inclusivity? We think about women, and children, that's at least 50% of the population. People who've got a disability, that's 1 in 6 people. Then we've got people in conflict and displaced. That's a huge percentage of many populations around the world. And so actually what we end up with is actually probably only about 5 or 10% of people who are just completely normal, which doesn't actually make them normal anymore, if you see what I mean. So when we're talking about vulnerabilities, we're actually talking about almost everyone, apart from the very lucky few, right? So we need to be inclusive, and we can do that by, again, thinking about this all vulnerability warning system, by embedding warnings as long-term social processes, having lots of different types of communication modes between different groups, making sure that it's relevant to people in terms of their time frame, connecting different levels of governance, so that bottom-up, top-down approach. And most importantly, I mean, there's many points here, but most importantly here, encouraging girls to be leaders within their communities to generate more inclusive warnings. And this has been done across the 4 different pillars in different ways. So, for example, when we look at disaster risk knowledge, the Daruja project in Kenya, for example, has done a really good job of working with the community and the local meteorological agencies to understand how weather warnings can be made appropriate for those groups in the camps, and they can actually reduce their risk and enhance their productivity in terms of agriculture and their livelihood. When it comes to monitoring and forecasting in Fiji, they found that women were often the ones who didn't get the warnings when storms were coming. So what did they do? They created a woman-led women's weather watch, where the women in the local community were trained with the meteorologist to be able to understand what's going on and convey that to their communities. Because they know when Uncle Bob is ill. They know that Grandma, Jo has gone into hospital recently, or that so-and-so is pregnant and might need that additional information. They are embedded within the community, so they create that bridge. The lovely video was created in Haiti. It was one of those ideas about creating lullaby. So you can this video was really about creating a form that people can remember, to help them understand what the patterns of trends are, to build their own resilience, build their own questions, the expert, I'm just really showcasing that as an example. Any questions? Those are the questions you can ask. And then in terms of implementing, finally, preparedness and response capacity across Bangladesh and India, wonderful cyclone projects, which are now, again, creating a multi-purpose, multi-gendered task force, and also putting women communities or women community leadership team together to run those programs, to really make sure that women are included in that process. And here, to me, is the pièce de résistance. To me, this is the ultimate all vulnerability warning system. So with cyclones, we can get a warning. From that warning, you need to get to safety. So you go to a cyclone shelter. This is a cyclone shelter built in Bangladesh. Bangladesh. It is a beautiful building. It's got a ramp so that it's accessible to all. But what they also did was, in that shelter, they built a school, and they also built a medical facility. So now that community can use that facility every single day as a school, and they've got health facilities. And then when there is an evacuation due to a storm, the children can still go to school, the parents can still go to work, and if there's any medical attention that's needed, there's a healthcare unit there. Isn't that brilliant? That is a great investment where it's not just for those days where we have to evacuate because of a cyclone. It's there being used every single day. And because of it, everybody knows where it is. And everyone's familiar with it, right? So really wonderful way here of bringing all the dots together and addressing the vulnerabilities to bring resilience, and beyond resilience, actually, you know, enhancing and building sustainability for that community and a better life. So these are some of the entry points in a report that we recently wrote on how to generate more inclusive warning systems. And in fact, but more recently, we were asked to create a sort of guidebook by the UNDRR. So we created this checklist of what you need to think about in terms of warning systems. And I added the fifth pillar here around governance. We'll get that fifth pillar in there. Fifth pillar of governance here. But we all know tick lists are a bit annoying because they just make us feel like we're not achieving, right? We all do that with our to-do lists. So what we also did was we created an implementation guide. So this really says, how can you actually implement? What things can you do with your limited resources in order to be able to tick off some of these boxes without having to reinvent the wheel or have a whole load of new resources? I'm really pleased to say it's now being translated into 4 different languages, and it's actually being used by countries all around the world. It's really amazing. So it's really exciting that people are really thinking about what can we do with what we've got to make our warning systems better and more inclusive. So really, key reflections are that multi-hazard warning systems are very useful, but they actually need to sit within the context of all vulnerabilities. We need to focus on people and vulnerabilities. This means walking away from the last mile and embracing that first mile of warnings. That warnings need to be multiple and continuous. They need to be embedded in society and part of the everyday fabric of society as well. And that way we can really build resilience and actually excel what we're doing in our communities. So thank you very much indeed for bearing with me in my very long presentation. Sorry, it's the first time I've delivered this presentation, so any feedback would be much appreciated. If you want to learn more about the centre, you can use that QR code. And then also just to highlight that if you are interested, we've got an event coming up, date to be confirmed, probably the end of August. We're going to be launching the world's first mental health warning system. So if anyone's interested in that, keep an eye on our website. We'll be having some information about that coming up. So thank you very much. And
I'm aware we advertise this from 1 to 2, so if anyone does need to go, feel free, but I'm also sure there will be many questions. So let's continue for a while for those who can't stay and have questions. So fire away. Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Carina. Very interesting and also innovative work in looking at this multi-vulnerability part. I have to say one of the things that really opened my mind about this all vulnerability warning system is a movie that is called Into Eternity. There is a movie about this waste disposal in Norway. It's a deep underground waste disposal. And they are reflecting actually how we can communicate danger or warning into a future population that discovered this underground. And so it's also, it made me reflect about, and your presentation made me reflect about this different scale. You know, you need to be very general so that everybody understands, but you need to be also very local and very tailored to the actual population and, you know, all these vulnerabilities. So how do you think we need to prioritize to be these all vulnerabilities in one system? Do we need to go very generic and so very understandable and very simple, or very complex and very local and very tailored? So there is this kind of opposition.
There is this opposition, and it's what I call being generally specific. So my students often ask me this. They're like, what should I do? It should just be sort of more generally specific, which is a complete contradiction in terms. But so I would argue that an all vulnerability warning system, much like a multi-hazard warning system, would be completely tailored to the local context, particularly for vulnerabilities, more so than hazard orientated. But that the sort of design and the setup and the structure or framework in which that's done could be international or national, right? So the idea is that with standardization, I actually looked at standardization for my PhD, it's really challenging because you need to have international levels of standardization as much as you need to have the local level. So there are ways of kind of bringing it together. And one way of doing that is by having standardized protocols and procedures at a national level that then support what the local is really needing. And that's kind of what happened in America following Hurricane Katrina and 9/11 with the incident command system and the way they revamped everything. So that the structure means that they can deal with the county level structure, but that everybody understands the framework. So they're able to come in and help and assist on that national level, but it's kind of tailored to what the local levels needed. So it's that kind of balance, I think. And that sort of top-down and bottom-up approach is that constant dialogue that's needed in order to create something that's vaguely specific. So, yeah, do you see what I mean? So it's really thinking about those different levels of standardization focus. But ultimately, at a local level, it has to be about the local level. And by doing that, it means that it has to be embedded in your everyday. And it is embedded not every day. If the fire alarm went off now, I'm sure all of you would run out of here straight away and not just wait until the alarm stops and go, is it a drill? Is it a drill? That often happens. And you know, there are alarms that are embedded in our everyday life. So this is what we need to achieve.
Great. Another question, Victor.
Yeah, I was thinking if you have a bit of a stable society, we did a lot of research in the Caribbean, and there you could flip the early warning from hazard to social or vulnerability then, because the knowledge about the vulnerability of the people we have that. If you have a country in turmoil, then your vulnerability is all over the place and changing all the time. So there, it's not possible, or you couldn't grasp or define that vulnerability because it's moving, changing, right? So is it flipping this to a vulnerability also means, well, it would be for countries where this doesn't happen.
I know you. I hear what you're saying. On one level, you're right. But I think on another level, it can work. So if you look at many of the camps in Goma, in the DRC, for example, built on a very active volcano that erupts. We're not actually that interested in eruptions. Actually, it's the everyday activity of gas that comes out that's actually killing people. There's a lot of work that's done by the Volcano Observatory there, for example. Very, very little resources, but they have a relationship with people who work out the camps, even though the people there are quite transient. Some of them are not, but there are ways of even in very, and I would argue that Goma is probably one of the most complex situations in the world, where there's so many different hazards. Like you've got volcanoes, cholera, Ebola, wildfires, flooding, drought, and then that's just the natural side. We know all the other human conflicts, everything you can imagine is happening. But there are ways of building resilience within camps and communities, but it has to be driven by those people. And one of the biggest challenges that you raise is actually about mobile data. So quite often the big agencies want people to give over their phone number or register for like warning information. And people don't want to do that because, you know, they don't want to give their personal information away. So there are certain issues like that that pose challenges to certain types of warnings. But again, if you make it about the vulnerabilities and, you know, like if you're not needing to go into the woods and cut down trees in order to be able to cook your food because you've got a more efficient stove, for example, then you're not going to be at risk to all the nasty human-made hazards that we see, and you're going to have more resilience as a group to actually have capacity to think about the volcanic hazards. Yeah, so it's you see what I mean? So it's that kind of shift, really.
Yeah.
Maybe I just wanted to add, like, to your point, because that is one thing areas of work that we have been working quite a lot at the Climate Center, is to look at the kind of the dynamic nature of vulnerability and how to match that with a warning. Because in some contexts, particularly when you have a lot of mobility of people, you cannot have a static early warning system, but you need to have a system that is able to kind of monitor the different kind of patterns of how, the fluctuation of mobility is, which is one of the biggest challenges. I don't think we have cracked the nut of really having a system that is able to do that. But I think I really, really like the approach of kind of looking at vulnerability, because it's about how do we create a system that can measure that volatility of vulnerability, not in a space vis-a-vis all the different hazards that are around. So
I agree, and I think I've been thinking about it recently. It's like, actually, if you're in like a long-term camp, like the Rohingya people, for example, or in Goma, sometimes quite a few people that are just internally displaced, but they've been there for a while. There is a sense of community even within that, even if the community is fragmented. But it's when you have the very transient populations that are really moving around and constantly having to flee wherever they are. I think that's the real challenge. So I heed your point on that. Yes, there's lots more work to be done. So there's a question.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Really nice. I'm also with Climate Center. So within the Red Cross, we often do our programming on the back of a vulnerability and capacity assessment. And they lead to contingency planning that are local or local heat action planning or even reaction protocols for this reaction. Now, is your proposal to do this more vulnerability-oriented warning system also showing the concern about the disconnect between these multi-hazard systems and these type of local plannings and local programming? Do you see that there's a big disconnect that you feel needs to be addressed much better within the humanitarian sector at large?
I can't necessarily comment on the humanitarian sector at large, but I do think there's a big disconnect in many different ways. So, in the UK, we're still seeing, just as a very simple answer, people still build on floodplains, right? We're still getting volcano observatories built on the side of volcanoes and hospitals being built right in the way of previous pyroclastic flows. This is not a good investment. This is not a good result. So bringing the hazard and the vulnerability together has been a challenge for many, many years, right? And that argument hasn't really been made. It has been made, it's just not seen to have been acted on in many times. And that's because it's being driven by political and economic factors behind it. So I think maybe this isn't answering your question, but my feel is that we really need to be shifting the way we sell warning systems to government, basically, and actually saying, this isn't necessarily about saving lives, or this is an investment. This is an investment in your country. This is an investment in the way people are doing things. It's an investment in the assets that you are making. If you're building a hospital, don't you want your hospital to last 30 years, not 30 months? Which in some cases has been the case. So I think from a higher level, there needs to be a change in the narrative about the cost benefit of integrating hazard and vulnerability. On a humanitarian level, I don't really feel like I'm in a position to answer that, but I think that the humanitarian sector have a huge amount on their plate, lots of things to do. And I think that really scientists, researchers should be helping to fill some of those gaps and support the work that's being done there to help you do your jobs, because you're on the ground, you know what's going on. And in that sense, I think you guys are actually quite well placed to bridge that gap between hazard and vulnerability. It's just you don't necessarily have the information or the resources to do that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Norman, fun question.
Oh, okay. I have about 10, and only ask 10. Thanks for
Try and find a smart way to
yes.
combine two or three.
I'm really following over 10 questions. So picking up on what you just said about selling systems to governments, it's all about communicating what we know, what we understand, what we think is best to people who can implement it. And that's hugely challenging, right? Reflecting on some of your slides, you showed these different frameworks, 4 pillars, 5 pillars, circular, non-circular, what wording is good or not, etc. You talk about going from hazard-oriented systems to vulnerability-oriented systems. We're talking about impact-based forecasting, which has actually hazard, vulnerability, exposure. It's like, that's a step beyond what you're talking about. So which one is now to some extent, right? To us, it's all kind of clear when we're having this discussion. If you talk to a decision maker, they're scratching their heads, right? It's really, really challenging. And I wonder, to what extent we are also in a way to blame by constantly inventing new terms and new concepts and contradicting ourselves, really. And the message that goes out is just a jumble of confusing acronyms, ultimately, right? So I think
Exactly
this is
like
something,
my start of my presentation. Yeah.
this is not a criticism in any way. This is reflecting on how we operate. I think we're all suffering from this. So here in this case, I partly disagree with what was said about vulnerability being variable. I mean, vulnerability is more of an inherent property that doesn't change from mornings to afternoons, right? But exposure does. So if you give an early warning and some people clear out, then of course you expect an income in halves because some people are away and so forth, right? So it's very difficult to decide, I think, what goes actually into that concept and what stays out. I don't have a perfect answer, but this is something that I think is really at the heart of what we are discussing here. Very, very briefly on your Leonardo da Ruiz example there from 85. I don't think vulnerability as such was really such an issue. It's quite binary. If you get hit by Lahar, you're dead. In this case, we saw what we also saw in 2021 in Germany, in the Ahr Valley, wrong communication or wrong decision making by people in power. Right? In Germany, it was a guy getting the early warning from ECMWF and saying, nah, it's wrong, and dismissed it, and people died. And in Amero was people with all sorts of agendas saying, no, people ignore the early warnings, stay put, and then they died. So, warning was there, vulnerability was clear, yet people died because some dude essentially made wrong decisions. Right? So
Yeah, so in the case of Leonardo da Ruiz, you could argue that the population were vulnerable because there wasn't a proper system in place that enabled the local decision makers to have a full understanding of the situation. And so they made decisions that were not in their elected best interest. So the population were made vulnerable by that, even though they weren't actually technically vulnerable. In a sense that, if the right decision had been made, people could have got to safety in time. So I hear what you're saying, and yes, too many acronyms. On one hand, people think warnings are just a very simple thing. And on the other hand, they're not, they're more complicated. And I felt there's a responsibility to try and think through those different complexities, because if we don't understand actually the nuances of it, right? Then we have things like you're talking about impact-based warning system. Well, impact-based warning system, okay, so that's going to depend again on the individual. How's it going to impact you? What should you do? And also, who cares if it's impact-based? What's the action you're going to do? And can you take that action? So impact is actually, we've already gone from impact-based to action-based now. And eventually we'll go to AI-generated personalized messages that will do everything for you, right? So it's kind of like there's this whole continuum of things. And I guess whatever term you want to call it, what this model is trying to say is that at the heart of it is people's vulnerabilities. And that's what we need to address. You can to some extent change your exposure if you're less vulnerable. You have more capacity, but it's really coming back to what is that vulnerability at its heart and thinking about what can we do to address that. But this is just the start of the conversation. So if maybe we should think about more exposure based, but I think the idea is that if we don't talk and think about different ways of thinking about warning systems, we're just going to get stuck in the same rift of the four different elements, the four different pillars, and just carry on taking that as the way to go forward. The weather-based community have come up with the warning value chain, which is another way of doing things. I don't necessarily agree with it a huge amount because I still feel like it's very linear and it suggests a chain when actually the people who are vulnerable to the hazard are the ones that should be driving the process. And they often have the knowledge as well to do it, local traditional knowledge and understanding. So it's really about the vulnerability element is really saying that we should be focusing on that community and going right at the heart of the issue, which is the vulnerability. So I don't know if that answers your question. I don't think it does answer your question, but I think it's
really a question. That was really more than
but I think the point is that what we want to do is we don't have the answers. Elle and I don't have the answers. We love to provoke conversation and discussion, even if it's controversial. So that's what we're trying to do. So this is trying to say, let's just rethink the way we do this and actually put what matters here, which is the people, and put them up front. Whether you call it vulnerability, whatever, it doesn't matter whether it's vulnerability or exposure to a certain extent. The same processes would apply in terms of engaging the local stakeholders, working with the international level organisations. You know, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter in a way. It's the mechanisms and the process that's important. Although of course we still have a long way to go with those really vulnerable populations. So.
I think this exchange sums it up nicely, at least in the sense that this is the start of a conversation rather than that we can wrap it all up here and now. I suggest we do close the lecture and the Q&A, but there is coffee and tea and water also in the back. So for those of you who want to exchange a bit more, feel free to stick around. This conversation will be part of your work at the UCL Warning Research Center. It will be part of ITC's work. It will be part of the Red Cross's work for the colleagues coming from there. I do have the same worry about adding another acronym, so that's maybe the one thing, but I think on the substance, there's a lot of similarity between different comments and a lot of work to do, which we will continue also this afternoon. So for those of you who just came to this public lecture and are not yet aware, Catalina will be defending her PhD at 4:30, right, at the Wire, and that's on early warnings in conflict settings, where of course this issue of vulnerability is front and center. And capacity. And early action, exactly. So that is the.
I don't have the answer, just ask.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I take it back now. Ask all the tricky questions.
So there will be more questions there for sure. Be prepared. There will be beautiful answers, hopefully. And there will be continued conversation thereafter this afternoon and beyond. But for now, let's give another warm round of applause to Carina. Thank you so much for
Thanks to those online as well who joined us. Thank you.
Indeed. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
No worries.
How was your skill last week?
So that was a good warm up, I guess.
I know, yeah, it was good. It was good. I love it. Carina.
How much you
Yeah, it's fine with John.
No,
I know that was like.
Yeah.